She knocked on my door at 7 in the evening, and the first thing out of her mouth was not hello. It was not good evening. It was not sorry to bother you. She stood in my doorway in a white coat with circles under her eyes, dark enough to look like bruises, and she told me she needed to talk to me about my sperm. I stood there holding a dish towel with both hands like it was the only thing keeping me connected to the ordinary world I had been living in 30 seconds earlier. A world where I was rinsing a plate and thinking about a soil compaction report I needed to review in the morning and whether I had enough coffee for tomorrow. Normal things, small things, the kind of things that fill up an evening when you have been alone for 5 years and you have gotten very good at it. I had not spoken more than 12 words to this woman in the 6 months we had lived across the hall from each other. I counted once during one of those nights where your brain latches onto something meaningless and will not let go. 12 words, maybe. A nod in the elevator. One conversation about the hallway light that maintenance kept ignoring while the bulb flickered like a dying star nobody cared enough to replace. And now she was standing at my door telling me she needed to discuss my reproductive material like it was a zoning variance or a noise complaint. I let her in because I did not know what else to do. Her name was Dr. Lena Ashford. I knew that from the nameplate I had seen on her clinic bag the one time she dropped it in the elevator, and I picked it up and handed it back to her. That was for the 12 words right there. Here you go. She had taken the bag without meeting my eyes and said thank you in a voice that sounded like it had been saying thank you to people all day and had nothing left to give the phrase. I knew she was a doctor. I knew she kept hours that would break most people because I heard her leave before the sun came up most mornings, her door closing with that particular sound she made soft and precise, like even that small act had to be performed correctly or it was not worth doing. I knew she had no pets, no regular visitors, and a plant on her kitchen windowsill that I could see through the gap in her curtain when I walked past her door. The plant was losing the fight, slowly week by week dropping leaves like a person shedding excuses until there was nothing left but the bare truth of neglect. What I did not know was why she was sitting at my kitchen table at 7 in the evening, looking like she had been awake for 3 days and had come to some decision during hour 70 that terrified her. I set the dish towel down. I sat across from her. I asked what was going on. My kitchen is not the kind of place that impresses anyone. The cabinet door on the left has been crooked for 2 years, and I keep meaning to fix it the way you keep meaning to call your dentist. The sink had dishes in it. The counter had a bag of potting soil I had not put away from the weekend. On the windowsill, a row of small clay pots with herb cuttings I was rooting for a client's garden. And on the highest shelf, pushed back against the wall where you would not notice it unless you were looking a single small plant in a ceramic pot with a hairline crack running down one side. Nobody ever asked about that plant. That was fine. I did not want to explain it. She told me she worked at a fertility clinic 4 blocks east. She had been the one running it for the past 8 years. Not working at it, running it. Her own practice built from nothing, funded with savings that had taken a decade to accumulate and loans she was still paying off. She told me that several weeks ago I had come in for a routine health panel and my file had passed through her system before she transferred it to a colleague. Standard procedure. My blood work, my physical results, everything a man gets checked when his insurance company sends him a reminder, he ignores 3 times and then finally obeys. She said she should have looked away from the results. She said she almost did. But the number stopped her the way a siren stops you on the highway. You do not choose to hear it. It just cuts through everything. She pulled a folded sheet of paper from her coat pocket and placed it on my kitchen table between the salt shaker and a smudge of dried coffee I had not wiped up. The paper was covered in terms I did not understand, graphs that looked like terrain maps of somewhere I had never been, and one number circled in blue ink at the top. 120 million. She told me that was my count per milliliter. She told me that average was somewhere between 15 and 50 million, and that anything above that was considered excellent. She told me my motility, meaning how well they moved, was 85%. She told me the morphology, meaning the shape, was near perfect. She delivered this information in the flat, careful voice of someone reading from a report she had read 1,000 times for other people, but had never expected to read at a neighbor's kitchen table for reasons that had nothing to do with professional obligation. She said I had the fertility profile of a man 10 years younger who had lived a very clean life. I told her I spent most of my time in the dirt. Literally, my hands had been in soil since I was 19 years old. I built a company from nothing but a shovel, a used truck, and everything my father taught me about the ground beneath your feet. Mercer Land Restoration. 40 employees now, government contracts, commercial sites. I took dead land, poisoned land, compacted urban lots where nothing had grown in decades, and I brought them back to life. It had made me wealthy in the way that does not show on the surface. The money was in the company, in the properties, in the equipment yard. It was not on my body or in my apartment or in the truck. I still drove the same model I had bought 12 years ago, with a dent in the tailgate I never fixed because it still ran fine. She did not smile at the dirt comment. She just kept looking at the paper like it contained something that frightened her more than it should. I asked her why she was telling me this at 7 in the evening at my kitchen table instead of through the clinic like a normal person. She did not answer right away. She folded the paper back up. She put it in her pocket. She looked around my apartment the way people look at a place when they are stalling for time. She took in the seed catalogs on the shelf by the window, the row of clay pots on the sill, the jacket hanging by the door, still carrying a streak of dried mud from the site I had been on that afternoon, a vacant lot in Dorchester. We were converting into a community garden for a neighborhood that had been asking for one for 11 years. Then she said she was not there as my doctor. She had officially removed herself from my care before she knocked on my door. She had transferred my file to her colleague, a Dr. Priya Hartley, and had signed the paperwork that morning. She was not my physician, she was my neighbor. And she was sitting in my kitchen because she had something to ask that she could not ask from behind a desk. Then she stopped talking. The silence stretched out long enough that I could hear the couple in the unit above us arguing about something. Their voices came through the ceiling, muffled and shapeless, like weather you cannot quite identify. I could hear my refrigerator humming its one note. I could hear her exhale slowly through her nose, the way people do when they are trying to hold something together by will alone, the way a dam holds water. Not because it wants to, but because it was built for exactly that purpose, and it does not know how to do anything else. I asked her if she was okay. She said she was not sure yet. I got up and made 2 cups of coffee because making coffee gave my hands something to do, while my brain tried to catch up with whatever was happening. The machine was old and loud, and it bought me almost 3 minutes of not having to figure out the right thing to say. I set 1 cup in front of her. She wrapped both hands around it, even though my apartment was warm. She looked down into it like she was hoping for instructions. She was striking in a way that took a moment to register. Sharp cheekbones, black hair cut asymmetrically shorter on one side, longer on the other, slightly disheveled in a way that suggested it had started the day precise and clean and had been through too many hours of her running her fingers through it while thinking. Her face was the kind that probably looks severe to most people. All angles and structure, the face of a woman who had learned early that softness was expensive and she could not afford it. But sitting this close across a small kitchen table with steam rising between us, I could see what the severity was guarding. It was not just tiredness behind her eyes. It was something heavier than that. Something that had been sitting on her shoulders for a long time, pressing down with the patience of gravity. I noticed her coat, white, clean, professional, but the collar was slightly worn where she had buttoned and unbuttoned it 1,000 times. Her shoes tucked under the chair had heels worn down unevenly. These were not the markers of a woman who was struggling because she did not care. They were the markers of a woman who had been pouring everything she had into something that was not herself. I asked her what she actually needed. She looked up from the cup. She looked directly at me for the first time since she had sat down. Her eyes were dark, almost black in the kitchen light, And they held a steadiness that I recognized from my own mirror on the mornings when I decided to keep going despite every reason not to. She said she would explain everything if I was willing to listen. I told her I was not going anywhere. She set the cup down. She straightened her spine. She pulled in a slow breath like a person standing at the edge of something high looking down, calculating whether the fall would kill them or just change everything. Then she started to talk. She told me she was 41 years old. She told me her hormone levels had been declining for 2 years, and the rate of decline had accelerated sharply in the last 6 months. She used terms I had to ask her to translate: AMH, FSH. She explained them with the patient clarity of someone who had sat across from frightened women hundreds of times and broken the numbers down into language the heart could process. Anti-Müllerian hormone, which measured the reserve she had left. Follicle-stimulating hormone, which told her how hard her body was working to compensate for what was disappearing. The numbers were moving in the wrong direction, and they were picking up speed. The difference was that this time she was the frightened woman. She told me she had tried 6 rounds of a procedure called IUI, intrauterine insemination. She explained it simply: a way of placing donor sperm as close to the egg as possible and hoping the biology cooperated. All 6 failed. Not dramatically, not with crisis or emergency, they just did not work. Like striking a match in wind 6 times and watching each flame die before it caught. She then tried IVF twice, in vitro fertilization. More intensive, more invasive, more brutal on the body. She described the injections she had given herself alone in her kitchen, the same kitchen across the hall that I walked past every day without knowing what was happening on the other side of that door. 12 weeks of daily shots, hormones that made her nauseated and swollen and emotionally raw in ways she had not been since she was a teenager. The eggs they retrieved were few. The embryos they created from those eggs stopped developing before they were viable. Just stopped. Like a clock that runs out of battery with no warning, no winding down, just silence where there used to be ticking. She sat in my kitchen telling me this the way someone describes damage to a house they love. Steady voice, careful words, eyes that gave away more than she probably intended. All of it paid out of her own pocket, every round, every injection, every ultrasound and blood draw and procedure room with its cold table and its fluorescent light and its particular kind of silence that exists in medical spaces where hope goes to be measured and found wanting. Her clinic was small, not a luxury practice. She charged less than market rate because she took patients without adequate insurance because she believed reproductive medicine should not be gated by wealth. That principle had cost her. Her savings were nearly gone. 2 rounds of IVF at her own expense had consumed most of what she had left. She was not a woman who had money and wanted a baby. She was a woman who had spent her money trying to become a mother and had nothing to show for it but an empty savings account and a body that was running out of time. I did not say anything. I just listened. That is something I learned from my father. Frank Mercer, 74 years old, retired carpenter in New Hampshire. A man who could build you a house or a bookshelf or a birdhouse with equal precision, and who believed that the most important tool you could own was the ability to shut up and pay attention. He never said it that gently. His version was closer to: you have 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason, so use them in that ratio. She told me she lived alone. She had for a long time. Her work had always come first. Not because she chose it that way in some grand, deliberate fashion, but because that was how it went. 1 year bleeding into the next. Each year a little fuller professionally and a little emptier in every other direction. Until she looked up one morning somewhere between her 39th and 40th birthday and realized the window she had been planning to climb through was closing faster than she had accounted for. She wanted a child, not as a concept, not as an item on a list she would get to someday between upgrading her medical equipment and paying off her student loans. She wanted to know what it felt like to raise someone, to watch a person grow from nothing into something with opinions and preferences, and a way of moving through the world that was partly her and partly mystery. She wanted to see her father's eyes again. Her father, Thomas Ashford. She said his name and then said he had passed away 3 years ago, and she moved on quickly the way you step over a crack in the sidewalk that you know goes deeper than it looks. One flat sentence, gone in 3 seconds. But I caught it. I held on to it. The way her voice thinned when she said his name. The way her fingers tightened around the coffee cup she was no longer drinking from. He had been a quiet man, she told me. Grew tomatoes in the backyard of a small house in New Hampshire. Never raised his voice in her memory. Had eyes that were dark and a little too serious for small talk, like they were always looking at something behind the thing in front of them. She had those eyes. She wanted to see them one more time, not in a mirror, but in someone new. Someone who would carry them forward after she could not. Her mother left when Lena was 9. Just left. No dramatic exit, no shouting, no slammed doors. One morning her mother was there making coffee, and the next morning she was not. And her father sat at the kitchen table and told her that sometimes people leave, and it is not because of anything you did. And that was all he ever said about it. He raised her alone in that small house with the tomato garden, and he taught her that needing someone was the fastest way to lose them. She learned the lesson so well she forgot it was a lesson. She thought it was the truth. I looked at her sitting across from me in my ordinary kitchen. This sharp, exhausted, careful woman who had spent 8 years helping other people build the things she wanted most. I felt something shift in my chest. It was not pity. I have been pitied, and I know what it looks like from the receiving end, and I would not do that to anyone. It was more like the feeling I get when I come across a plant that has been trying to grow in wrong conditions. Not dying exactly, not thriving either. Just working so hard with so little to show for it that the effort itself becomes a kind of quiet tragedy. She told me there was one option left, a protocol she rarely recommended to her own patients because the odds were low and the requirements were specific. A natural cycle. No medication, no hormonal intervention, no drugs hammering her body into producing what it could not sustain. Just her body doing what it could on its own. One egg maybe in a given month, timed carefully around the narrow window when that egg might be viable. The advantage was that it preserved whatever she had left. No more damage, no more pharmaceutical assault on a system that was already depleted. The disadvantage was that it required a specific kind of donor. Fresh, not frozen. The freezing and thawing process degraded the material enough to matter when you were already working with margins this thin. She could not afford another round of clinic-grade procedures anyway. This was the option that remained after everything else had been stripped away. She looked at me. I looked at her. I understood what she was asking before she said it, but I needed to hear her say it because some things have to exist in spoken language before they are real. She needed a donor. Close. Available within a very specific biological window. Someone whose numbers were exceptional enough to give the natural cycle a legitimate chance. She needed the best one she could find, and he lived across the hall. I sat back in my chair. I put my hand on the back of my neck. I looked at the ceiling for a moment because I needed somewhere neutral to point my eyes while my brain processed the magnitude of what was happening at my kitchen table on an ordinary Tuesday evening. She told me she had watched me carry plants up 4 flights of stairs the week the elevator broke. Not small plants. Full-grown specimens in heavy clay pots, the kind that weigh 40 pounds and require you to stop on each landing and set them down and catch your breath before continuing. She said she had watched me through her peephole because she had heard the footsteps and the heavy breathing, and she was curious what kind of person did that voluntarily. She had watched me water the neglected fern by the stairwell that building management had left to die. She had heard me on the phone once standing outside by the building entrance talking to a client about a dying garden. She said the patience in my voice stopped her in her tracks. She stood on the sidewalk and listened to a stranger talk a panicking homeowner through the steps of saving a row of hydrangeas, and she thought that is the kind of person who understands that some things are worth the effort even when the odds are not good. My kitchen was very quiet after she finished. I looked at her for a long moment, at the lines of tiredness around her eyes, at the hands wrapped around a coffee cup that had gone cold long ago, at the way she was holding herself very still, like she believed that if she moved, the whole architecture of this moment would collapse and she would have to rebuild it from nothing, and she did not have enough left to rebuild anything. I did not say yes. That surprised her. I could see it in the micro movement of her eyebrows, the slight parting of her lips, the way her spine, which had been so straight it looked uncomfortable, softened just slightly, as if something had been knocked loose. She had prepared for yes, and she had prepared for no. She had not prepared for wait. I told her I needed to think about it. I told her I understood the numbers, and I understood the stakes, and I understood why she was asking me and not someone else. But this was not a decision I could make between one breath and the next, and anyone who told her it was would be lying to her or to themselves. Her jaw tightened. Not anger, something closer to controlled disappointment, the kind that lives in the muscles before it reaches the face. She stood. She moved to the door. At the threshold, she turned, and her voice carried the particular weight of someone who has learned to deliver difficult facts without flinching. My window is 11 days from now. After that, I wait another month. Every month I wait, the probability drops. She said it cleanly, clinically, but her hand, the one that was not holding the door frame, was closed into a fist at her side, and she did not seem to know it was there. I watched her cross the hall. I heard her door close. I sat back down at my kitchen table, and I looked at the plant on the highest shelf, the one nobody asked about, the one Claire planted the week we got married. Claire, my wife, 5 years gone. Ovarian cancer, which carries its own particular cruelty when you have spent your marriage talking about children and timing and then someday arrives wearing a white coat and using words like stage and prognosis, and we caught it late. I took care of her for 14 months. I fed her when she could not feed herself. I carried her to the bathroom when her legs stopped cooperating. I slept in a chair next to her bed for the last 6 weeks because she was afraid of the dark, and I could not fix what was killing her, but I could make sure she was never alone in it. After she died, I closed every door I had, not dramatically, not with tears or breakdowns, or the kind of cinematic grief that makes for good stories. I just stopped. I stopped going to dinners with friends. I stopped answering calls that were not work-related. I stopped looking at people the way you look at people when you are open to the possibility that they might matter. I poured everything I had into the company. I grew it from 12 employees to 40. I won contracts I had no business winning. I turned Mercer Land Restoration into the most respected urban soil rehabilitation firm in New England. And I did it by working 16-hour days, 6 days a week for 5 years. Because if my hands were in the dirt and my brain was solving drainage problems, then neither of them had time to reach for what was not there anymore. Ray Dominguez told me once, standing in the middle of a site in Roxbury where we were remediating lead-contaminated soil for a school playground, that I was building gardens for the whole city, and there was not a single flower in my own house. Ray had been with me for 20 years. Site manager, best friend if I was being honest, which I tried to be about most things except the ones that mattered. He knew about Claire. He had carried one end of her coffin. He had earned the right to say things like that to me. I told him I was fine. He looked at me the way he looks at soil test results he does not believe. Then he went back to work because Ray also understood that some men need to arrive at the truth on their own schedule, and pushing only makes them dig in deeper. Now I was sitting in my kitchen at 8:30 in the evening, and a woman I barely knew had just asked me to help her make a child, and the plant my dead wife had put in the ground 6 years ago was alive on my highest shelf, and I did not know what any of it meant except that my chest hurt in a way I had not felt in a long time. I called my father. Frank Mercer picked up on the second ring the way he always did, like he had been sitting next to the phone waiting for exactly this call. though I knew he had probably been in his workshop sanding something or reading a woodworking magazine from 1997, because Frank did not believe in disposing of information just because it was old. I did not tell him specifically what Lena had asked. I told him someone had come to me for help with something big, and I was not sure I had the courage for it. He was quiet for a moment. Frank's silences were not empty. They were the silences of a man who had spent 50 years measuring twice before cutting once, and who applied the same principle to words. Then he asked me if I knew why the plant in my kitchen was still alive. I told him it was because I watered it. His voice carried the weight of a man who had watched his son disappear into work for 5 years and had waited patiently the way he waited for wood glue to set, because rushing it only makes it weaker. You are scared because last time you got hurt, but you are still watering that plant. You are scared and you still show up every morning and you keep it alive. That is not weakness. He paused. Being afraid is not a reason to stop watering. I sat with him that for a long time after we hung up. My father had a way of compressing entire philosophies into sentences short enough to fit on a carpenter's pencil. He had been doing it my whole life. When I was 12 and wanted to quit Little League because I struck out 4 games in a row, he said the bat does not swing itself and drove me to practice. When I was 23 and the first landscape job I ever bid on fell apart because the client changed their mind, he said dirt does not care about your feelings, it just needs you to show up. When Claire died and I called him from the hospital parking lot unable to speak, he drove 4 hours from New Hampshire and sat next to me on a bench outside the emergency room and did not say a single word for 45 minutes. And then he said the ground is still there and took me home. 2 days later, I knocked on Lena's door. She opened it wearing scrubs and an expression that told me she had not slept well. Behind her, I could see into her apartment for the first time. It was clean in the way that empty places are clean. Minimal furniture, all of it chosen for function rather than comfort. No photographs on the walls. No personal items on the surfaces. The kitchen counter was bare except for a kettle and a single mug. It looked like a place someone occupied rather than lived in. The only sign of actual life was the plant on her windowsill, the one I had been watching lose its leaves for weeks through the gap in her curtain. Up close, it looked worse. A pothos that had given up trying. I told her I would do it. I watched something move through her face that she tried very hard to control. Relief and terror arriving at the same time and fighting over the same set of muscles. But I had conditions. She straightened. The clinical armor came back up so fast I could almost hear it click into place. First, I told her I would not take payment. She blinked. That was the first crack. Not a large one. A hairline fracture in the composure, the kind you only see if you are looking for it. She began to explain that payment was not about money. It was about structure, about protecting both parties from the complexity that arises when transactions are not clearly defined. I listened to her say all of that. Then I told her that I knew she had spent nearly everything she had on the IVF rounds. I told her I saw it in the worn collar and the shoes and the clinic that charged below market rate because she believed in something bigger than profit. I was not guessing. I was reading the evidence the way I read soil. You learn to see what is actually there, not what someone wants you to see. Something in her face hardened. Not against me, exactly, against being seen. Her financial reality was a private wound, and I had just touched it without permission. The self-respect in her was almost architectural in its construction. Load-bearing walls she had built over decades. I understood standing in her doorway that if I pushed wrong, she would close this door and I would hear it lock, and that would be the end of whatever this was before it started. So I said it differently. I told her there are things that lose their value the moment you attach a price. I told her this was one of them. I was not a product. I did not want to be a line item she filed away in a drawer. If she wanted my help, it came free of charge because the moment money changed hands, it changed what this was, and I was not willing to let that happen. She stared at me for a long time. I could see her searching for the counter-argument, running through her protocols, testing my words against her framework. She was a woman who ran on logic the way my truck ran on diesel, and I had just poured something into the tank that the engine did not recognize. Second condition, I told her I would not do this like a clinical procedure. No ovulation timers going off on a smartwatch while she coached me through the mechanics. If we were going to do this, we were going to do it like two human beings who were actually present with each other. No lab codes, no charts on the wall, just people. She was quiet long enough that I thought she was going to sway him. Third condition, I told her I wanted to read the contract, all of it. Every clause, every provision, every piece of legal language she had constructed to define the boundaries of what we were about to do. I was not going to sign in something I did not understand. She looked at me the way people look at something they cannot quite categorize. Like I was a word in a language she had started studying but had not mastered yet. She agreed to all three. The contract appeared under my door before 7 the next morning. 38 pages. She had written it herself. I could tell because the language was precise but not polished the way a lawyer's language is polished. A lawyer rounds the edges. Lena's contract had sharp corners. She could not afford a lawyer, so she had done what she always did. She handled it alone. I read it at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a pencil. I read slowly. I read the way I read soil reports, which is to say, I did not skip anything and I did not assume I understood something just because the words looked familiar. My father taught me that too. He said a man who signs something he has not read has already lost whatever he thought he was getting. I made it to page 26 before I stopped. Clause 14. In the event of successful conception, the donor hereby relinquishes all rights to be informed regarding the status, progress, or outcome of the pregnancy, unless the recipient elects at her sole discretion to initiate contact for the purpose of providing such information. I read it 3 times. Then I set the pencil down and looked at the ceiling and thought about what kind of person writes a clause that gives them the legal right to disappear. That afternoon, I saw her in the elevator. She was holding her clinic bag in one hand and her keys in the other, and she had the look of a woman who had already been awake for 10 hours and the day was only half over. She asked me if I had reviewed the terms. I told her I had read every page. Then I asked her about Clause 14, why she had written it. Her answer came quick and clean the way answers come when you have rehearsed them. To protect you. So you would not be pulled back into something by obligation. So you could walk away and live your life. I watched her face while she said it. Then I asked her the real question. Or is it to protect you so you can vanish and nobody follows? She did not answer. Her eyes shifted just slightly like a compass needle disturbed by a magnet passing too close. For a half second, the armor was not there, and I saw what was underneath. Not anger, not defensiveness, something closer to recognition. The look of a woman who had just heard someone read aloud from a page she thought she had hidden. The elevator opened. She stepped out. I stepped out. We walked to our respective doors on opposite sides of a hallway that suddenly felt narrower than it ever had. I went inside. I sat down. I picked up the contract, and I signed it. But I drew a single line through Clause 14 with my pencil, and I wrote in the margin in block letters clear enough to read from across a room, I want to know. I slid the contract under her door. An hour later, I heard her door open and close. Then nothing. The next morning when I checked, the contract was back under my door. On the margin next to my handwriting, she had signed her initials. Small, precise, but there. The window opened 2 days later. She knocked on my door at 8 in the evening. She was wearing a silk blouse, the only piece of clothing I had ever seen her in that was not medical. The first button was undone, like she had been trying to relax on the walk across the hall and had only made it 1 button's worth of distance from the woman she was at work. She had a folder in her hand. I took the folder out of her hand and set it on the kitchen counter without opening it. She watched me do that the way she had watched me move through every interaction we had ever had, like she was collecting data on a species she had never encountered before, cataloging behaviors, looking for the pattern that would explain why I kept doing things that did not match her predictions. I made her tea. She had not asked for it. I made it anyway. Chamomile because she looked like a woman who had been running on cortisol and cold coffee for a decade and whose body had forgotten what calm felt like. I set it in front of her. She sat on my couch, which was the opposite of everything in her apartment. Worn, soft, slightly lopsided on the left side from years of me sitting in the same spot. She lowered herself onto it and looked almost uncomfortable with how comfortable it was, like she had forgotten that furniture was allowed to yield. We talked for an hour before anything else happened. She told me about a patient she had seen that day, a woman in her late 30s who had just received a positive result after 2 years of trying. She described how the woman cried not the quiet, dignified tears of relief, but the messy, full-body, ugly crying of someone who had been holding her breath so long she had forgotten she was doing it. Lena had stayed in the room for the announcement and then stepped out into the hallway and stood with her back against the wall and felt something she could not name. I told her it sounded like grief wearing someone else's coat. She looked at me sharply the way you look at someone who has just said something you thought only you knew. Her voice was quieter when she repeated it. Yes, exactly that. She was not used to being seen that clearly. I could tell by the way she turned slightly away from me afterward, angling her body toward the window, creating a few degrees of distance that she probably did not realize she was creating. It was instinct, get too close to seeing her, and she would rotate just enough to put the vulnerable side out of view. When the evening finally arrived at the reason she had come, it was nothing like the transaction she had designed it to be. She had prepared herself for efficiency, clinical timing, a biological event managed with precision. I quietly refused to let that happen. I was slow and deliberate. I paid attention to her the way I pay attention to soil before I plant anything in it. You do not rush that. You do not skip the part where you learn what it needs. You put your hands in and you feel for what is there and what is missing, and you respond to that, not to a schedule, not to a chart, not to a number on a screen. Afterwards, she lay very still for a moment, like she was waiting for herself to reassemble into the version of Lena Ashford who had everything under control. That woman was trying to come back online and finding the connection disrupted. Then she exhaled, long and slow, like she had been holding that particular breath for years and did not know it until it left her. I did not say anything. Some moments do not need narration. They just need to be allowed to exist in their own silence. She left before midnight. She crossed the hall. I lay in the dark staring at my ceiling and thinking about the fact that her hand had stopped trembling somewhere in the middle of the evening without either of us saying a word about it, and that the trembling had been there from the moment she sat down, and I had been tracking it the way I track weather changes on a job site unconsciously with a part of my brain that never stops monitoring the conditions. I did not know what we had started, but I knew it was not nothing. I knew it the way I know when soil has shifted. You cannot always see it, but you can feel the ground under your feet behaving differently. And if you have spent enough years paying attention to the ground, you trust that feeling more than you trust your eyes. She knocked on my door the next evening, holding a container of leftover pasta and a face that was trying very hard to look casual. She said she had made too much. I glanced past her shoulder at her apartment across the hall at the kitchen. I could partially see through the open door, and I did not point out that her kitchen looked like it had never produced a meal in its life. The stove appeared to be decorative. The counters were bare enough to perform surgery on. I took the pasta, I heated it up. I made her sit down and eat half of it back, which she did with the expression of a person who had forgotten that eating dinner was something people did on purpose rather than as an afterthought between tasks. That was how it started, not with a plan, not with a protocol. With a container of pasta that she almost certainly bought from the Italian place on the corner and transferred into her own container to make it look homemade, and two people sitting across from each other in a kitchen with dirty dishes in the sink and a crooked cabinet door and the smell of reheated marinara sauce, and nothing in the room that looked like a medical chart or a legal document. Just two people eating dinner because one of them had invented a reason to knock on the other's door and the other had known it was invented and let her in anyway. I noticed as she left that night that for the first time in 5 years, my apartment did not feel too large for one person. The walls had not moved. The furniture was the same. But something in the architecture of the emptiness had shifted the way light changes in a room when you open a window you had forgotten was there. Not because the room is different, because you are letting something in that you had been keeping out, and the room is responding to you, not the other way around. I stood in my kitchen doorway and I looked at Claire's plant on the high shelf, and for the first time, I did not feel like it was watching me. I just felt like it was growing, the way plants do, quietly, persistently, without asking permission. And I thought about what my father said. Being afraid is not a reason to stop watering. I went to bed. I did not sleep for a long time. But for the first time in 5 years, the not sleeping felt less like endurance and more like anticipation. Like the ground was thawing and something underneath it was getting ready to push through, and I was lying in the dark above it, waiting to see what it would become. The 2-week wait is its own particular species of suffering. I have waited for soil to thaw after hard winters. I have waited for root systems to take hold in ground that every test said would not support them. I have waited in hospital rooms for doctors to come through doors with news that would either let me breathe again or teach me a new way to live without breathing. But waiting alongside someone who knows too much about what they are waiting for is a different kind of endurance. Lena understood every biological variable, every hormonal shift, every cellular event that needed to occur in sequence for this to work. Knowledge was not her comfort. It was a longer list of things to be afraid of, and she carried that list around on her shoulders like a second skeleton heavier than the one she was born with. I could not take it from her. You cannot fix someone's fear by arguing with it. You cannot hand a person peace of mind the way you hand them a cup of coffee. Fear is soil level. It lives below the surface, and if you try to rip it out, you damage the roots of everything growing next to it. So I did the only thing I knew how to do. I stayed close. Not in her way, not on top of her, just close enough that when she turned around, I was there. And when she did not turn around, she knew I was there anyway. I brought a ZZ plant over for the corner of her living room 3 days after the pasta evening. The kind of plant that grows in low light and asks almost nothing from you, requires water maybe once every 2 weeks, tolerates neglect with a patience that borders on stubbornness. I set it down on the bare floor next to her bookshelf, which held medical journals arranged by date and nothing else, no novels, no photographs, no objects that existed solely because they were beautiful. She looked at the plant the way she had looked at everything I did since the beginning, scanning for the mechanism, running diagnostics on my motivation, searching for the angle, the leverage, the hidden term in the contract of my behavior that would explain why a man she barely knew kept doing things that cost him nothing and expected nothing in return. What are you doing? Her voice carried the edge of someone who has been surprised too many times by generosity that turned out to be something else dressed up. I told her it was a plant, just a plant, nothing encoded in it, no agenda growing inside the soil. Nothing stays alive in my apartment for long. She said it like a weather report, factual, not self-pitying, just an observation about the climate she had created in her own living space, the way you might note that a certain region gets no rainfall and adjust your expectations accordingly. I told her this one would. She tested that theory. She did not water the ZZ plant for 6 days. I noticed when I came over on the 7th day to tighten the hinges on her bathroom cabinet, which I had heard squeaking through the wall at night. The soil was dry and the leaves had dulled from glossy to matte, the plant's quiet way of saying it was managing, but would prefer not to be ignored. I moved it closer to the window where the afternoon light fell in a pale stripe across her floor. She watched me do it from the doorway of the bathroom, where she had been standing with her arms crossed while I worked on the hinges, and something in her posture loosened by a degree so small you would need an instrument to measure it. I think that was the moment she stopped looking for my angle. Not because I convinced her with words. Words are easy to construct and easier to distrust. She stopped because I kept showing up, and the things I did were too small to be calculated and too consistent to be accidental. Some things do not have an architecture of motive behind them. Some people just show up because showing up is what they do. I fixed the crooked cabinet door in her kitchen on a Tuesday afternoon while she was on a call in her bedroom with her office manager about scheduling. The squeak had been bothering me for weeks. Not the squeak in her apartment, the one in mine. My cabinet had the same problem, same model, same builder, same lazy hinge installation. I had fixed mine 3 months ago. Hers I had been listening to through the wall, the soft screech every time she opened it for a mug or a glass, and it was the kind of small broken thing that you stop noticing after a while, but that chips away at you in frequencies below conscious hearing. I heard her pause mid-sentence on our call when the squeaking stopped. A silence on the other side of the bedroom door that lasted about 3 seconds longer than a normal conversational pause. When she came out after the call, she looked at the cabinet and then she looked at me and she did not say anything. She did not need to. The cabinet hung straight and true and closed without sound, and that was enough. While I was underneath the cabinet adjusting the lower hinge, I saw the bottom shelf, an open cardboard box pushed toward the back. Inside, a cluster of syringes still in their packaging, empty glass vials with medical labels, and a small spiral notebook, the kind you buy at a drugstore for $1 filled with Lena's handwriting. Dates, dosages, times. 12 weeks of entries, each line written in the same precise script, each one representing a morning or evening when she had stood alone in this kitchen and injected herself with hormones that would rearrange her body chemistry in pursuit of something her body kept refusing to give her. I did not open the notebook. I did not move the box. I closed the cabinet and I stood up and I washed my hands and I said nothing. But that night back in my own apartment, I sat at my kitchen table for a long time. I looked at the ceiling and I saw the 12 weeks of that notebook laid out in front of me like a topographic map of private pain. Each injection was a choice she made alone. Each failed cycle was a door she closed behind her and kept walking. And now I was involved in the next attempt, the last attempt, the one she had crossed a hallway and swallowed her pride to ask for. I felt something I had been avoiding feeling. I cared about her, not the way you care about a neighbor or a patient or a project, the way you care about a person whose suffering has become partially yours, whose hope has attached itself to your hope, without asking permission, whose face you think about when you are driving to work in the morning for reasons that have nothing to do with contracts or clauses or biological windows. I cared about her more than the agreement allowed, and that scared me because the last time I cared about someone at this depth, I buried her. The next afternoon, I brought a spider plant for her bathroom, bright green, cascading, the kind that cleans the air and propagates so aggressively it practically begs to be shared. 2 days after that, a fiddle leaf fig for the corner by her balcony door. It was large, almost 4 feet. I carried it up the stairs because the elevator was being serviced, and by the time I got it through her front door, I was sweating through my shirt, and she was standing in her living room with an expression caught between disbelief and something I had not seen on her face before: amusement. She told me it was too big. She would have to move the chair to make room. There was no space for a tree in an apartment this small. Her voice carried the exasperated tone of someone who has spent their entire life in controlled environments and is now watching a man introduce chaos into her living room, one potted organism at a time. She moved the chair. She did not ask me to take the fig back. Her apartment was changing. Slow shifts measured in degrees so small that if you were not paying attention, you would miss them entirely. The clinic bags she used to hang precisely by the door every evening now appeared on the couch, sometimes dropped there in the brief moment of relief between arriving home and becoming the person who organized everything. She began making actual tea in the evenings instead of drinking the 3-day-old coffee that sat in her pot like evidence of a life that did not have time to restart itself each morning. She left a book on the side table one day, not a medical journal, but a novel, something with a cracked spine that suggested she had read it before and had pulled it from whatever box she kept the parts of herself that were not professional. One night she came home from a long shift and I was already there. Sitting on her balcony with 2 mugs because I had heard her key in the lock from my apartment and I had timed the tea so it would be ready when she walked through the door. She appeared in the balcony doorway and stopped. Something moved through her face that she did not attempt to conceal, which was new. Until then, she had curated every expression. This one she let arrive unedited, and it looked like the face of someone who has been walking through a house they thought was empty and has just heard a voice from the kitchen. She sat down. She looked at the city below us, the grid of lights and traffic and lives being lived in apartments, where other people were also sitting down and picking up cups and trying to figure out whether they were going to be okay. She told me she had lost a patient that day. Not physically. The woman's pregnancy had not survived. First trimester. Lena had delivered the news and then gone straight to her next appointment because the clinic was small and there was no one to cover for her, and the next patient had been waiting 40 minutes, and the schedule did not have a line item for grief. I did not tell her I was sorry. She had heard that word 10,000 times, and it had worn smooth from use like a river stone with no edges left to grip. Instead, I told her that what she carried sounded enormous. Every time she answered, her voice held the weight of all of them. Every patient, every phone call, every ultrasound screen that showed an empty space where a heartbeat should have been. I asked her if she ever set it down. She looked at the city. I do not know where to put it. I thought about that for a moment. Then I told her that was the problem with building a house without shelves. Eventually, every flat surface fills up, and you are left standing in the middle of a room holding something heavy, with nowhere to set it down and no free hand to build the shelf you need. She laughed, a short, genuine sound that escaped before she could review and approve it. The kind of laugh that surprises the person making it more than the person hearing it. Then she went quiet and looked out at the city for a long time, and I let her sit in whatever she was sitting in without trying to fix it or narrate it or fill it with noise. She told me that night about her father in a way she had not before. Not the summary, not the facts, the texture. Thomas Ashford, who could make a tomato plant produce in soil that had no business supporting anything, who never once raised his voice in her memory, whose hands were always stained with earth, and whose shirts always smelled like green things growing. She told me he used to sit on the back porch in the evening and eat a tomato like an apple juice running down his chin, and that he always offered her the first one of the season like it was a ceremony. She wanted to see his eyes again. She said it simply, not in a mirror, in someone new, someone who would carry them forward. And then I told her something I had not told anyone except Ray, and even with Ray, I had only given the outline, not the color. I told her about Claire. I told her that we had wanted a child, that the conversation had been ongoing for the last 2 years of our marriage, the happy years before the diagnosis. We had been planning, timing, researching, doing everything that careful people do when they are building toward the most important thing they will ever build. And then the diagnosis arrived, and the timeline evaporated, and the planning became a different kind of planning, the kind that involves hospice schedules and pain management, in the particular mathematics of how many good days you might have left and how to spend them without wasting a single one. I told her about the plant on my top shelf. Claire planted it the week we got married. She bought it at a farmer's market on a Saturday, a small thing in a ceramic pot that already had a crack in it, and she told me she wanted something alive in our kitchen that would grow alongside our marriage. I kept it alive for 5 years after she died. I did not know why exactly. I watered it every Sunday. I moved it to the high shelf because I could not look at it at Libby's anymore, but I could not let it die either, so I put it where I would know it was there without having to see it every time I made coffee. Lena did not speak for a long time after I finished. The city moved below us. A siren passed somewhere in the middle distance, rising and falling and rising again. Then she asked me why I had agreed to help her knowing all of that. I told her the truth, because I know what it means to not have enough time. Claire and I did not have enough time. The window closed before we could step through it, and I watched it close and I could not do anything about it. She still had time, maybe not much, maybe only this one cycle, this one month, this one chance, but she still had it. And I was not going to stand across the hall and watch another window close when I had the ability to hold it open. She looked at me in the dark on that balcony, and I saw something in her eyes that I had not seen before, not gratitude, not relief, something rawer than that. The look of a person who has been carrying a weight alone for so long that the muscles have adapted and the bones have adjusted and the whole body has reorganized itself around the burden, and then someone reaches over and puts their hand on the load. Not to take it, just to touch it, just to say, I see this, I know what this weighs. You are not imagining it. She was holding her tea and I reached over and took the mug from her fingers and set it on the railing and held her hands instead. They were cold, even though the evening was mild. She did not pull away. She looked down at our hands together on the armrest of a cheap balcony chair, and she breathed in and she breathed out, and neither of us said anything because the silence was doing the talking, and it was more articulate than either of us could have been. Ray had confronted me 3 days earlier at the Dorchester site. He had watched me space out while reviewing a drainage plan, and he asked me what was occupying the part of my brain that was supposed to be calculating water flow. I told him it was complicated. He told me that for 5 years I had been building gardens for the entire city and that my own house did not contain a single flower. He told me I had turned myself into a machine after Claire. A good machine, a productive machine, but a machine. I told him I was fine. He shook his head. You are not fine. You are just very good at pretending to be fine. There is a difference around you. Then he noticed a shift in my demeanor. His eyes narrowed. He asked if there was someone. I hesitated long enough to answer without speaking. Ray leaned against the fence around the job site and told me about his ex-wife, Maria, how she left him when her career took off and his stayed where it was, how he spent 2 years angry about it before he realized the anger was not about Maria leaving. It was about the fact that he had believed somewhere deep in the wiring that a woman who earned more and knew more and moved in bigger circles would eventually look at him and see what he feared he was not enough. Not enough polish, not enough letters after his name, not enough distance from the dirt. Soil and marble do not sit on the same floor. His voice was matter of fact, carrying the scar tissue of experience rather than the heat of fresh wounds. I heard him. But that evening on Lena's balcony, holding her cold hands while the city hummed below us, I also understood that Ray's map was drawn from his own territory. His fences were real, but they were his. The following week, Lena's clinic ran into trouble. I learned this not because she told me, but because I saw the evidence the way I see evidence of soil contamination. You do not need someone to announce it. The signs are there if you know how to read them. I was in her apartment fixing a dripping faucet in the bathroom. While I was under the sink, I heard her on the phone in the kitchen speaking in the tight, compressed voice she used when she was negotiating something she could not afford to lose. When I came out to wash my hands, a letter was sitting on the kitchen counter. The header was large and the number at the bottom was larger, and the words lease renewal and increased rate in 30-day notice were legible from 5 feet away. Her landlord was raising the rent on the clinic space. The increase was significant enough to consume whatever remained of her operating margin. She was facing the possibility of losing the practice she had built over 8 years. I said nothing about the letter. She did not bring it up. But the knowledge settled into me the way contamination settles into groundwater. Invisible on the surface, present in every sample you draw. I could have written a check that would have solved the problem before it became a crisis. The amount on that letter was meaningful to her and negligible to me, and the mathematics were brutally simple. But I knew Lena, A direct financial rescue would register as the thing she feared most: dependency, a rich man stepping in to save the struggling woman. The transaction that transforms gratitude into debt and debt into resentment and resentment into distance. So I did something else. I called a contact at a corporate wellness company that contracted with several of the firms I had done landscaping work for. I described a small fertility clinic in Boston that would be an excellent partner for their employee health program. I made the introduction and I stepped back and I let the machinery of business do what business machinery does. 2 weeks later, Lena received a call from a company she had never heard of, offering a corporate partnership that would bring a steady stream of insured patients through her doors at rates that would more than cover the lease increase. She told me about it over tea on the balcony, gesturing with her cup, and for a moment she looked like a woman who had just been told that the ground beneath her was solid after all. I sat there and I listened and I felt the weight of what I had done, because I knew even as I watched her face brighten that I had just laid a fuse. I had helped her in secret. I had made a decision about her life without her knowledge or consent. I had done the thing that powerful men do when they encounter problems they can solve. I solved it quietly, efficiently, without asking whether she wanted it solved or whether she needed to solve it herself. Then Portland arrived in the conversation like weather changing. She told me on the balcony one evening, 10 days into the wait, the air carrying the first edge of fall coolness that Boston gets in September. She had committed months ago to leading a satellite clinic in Portland. A colleague doctor, Priya Hartley, had relocated there earlier in the year, and the opportunity had come through Priya's network. Lena had signed the agreement before any of this, before the contract, before the pasta, before the plants, 6 weeks. She said the number like she was handing me a medical result she had been trained to deliver without inflection. But her eyes moved to me sideways, not directly testing the temperature the way you test bath water with your wrist before committing. I stood up from my chair. I moved behind her and put my hands on the balcony railing on either side of where she sat, close enough that she could feel me there, but not quite touching. She went very still. I thought about every plant I had ever watched orient itself toward whatever light source was available, regardless of where it started or what obstacles stood in the way. I had seen the roots crack concrete. I had seen seedlings push through asphalt. I had seen a willow tree on a site in Cambridge grow sideways for 6 feet to reach a gap in a fence where the sun came through for 40 minutes each afternoon. Plants do not stop growing because the conditions change. They find the new angle. They push toward whatever light is available from wherever they are standing. She turned in the chair and looked up at me, and for the first time since I had met her, she looked genuinely uncertain. Not about a protocol or a treatment plan or a lease negotiation. About what she wanted. I kissed her. Not for the contract, not for the timing or the window or any number on any chart. I kissed her because she had told me about her father's eyes and about tomatoes eaten like apples on a porch in New Hampshire. And because I had told her about Claire and the plant on the high shelf, and because the distance between us had been shrinking for weeks in increments too small to measure, and now there was none left, and pretending otherwise was a form of dishonesty I was not willing to practice. She kissed me back with the force of 6 months of carefully maintained distance, dissolving in a single unplanned moment. When she pulled back, she looked almost startled by herself. I tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. Variables change, I told her. Her voice was steadier than her eyes. That is not a very scientific way to look at things. That is exactly the point. She laughed, softer this time. Then she leaned her head against my shoulder and looked out at the city, and the fiddle leaf fig behind us caught the breeze through the open door, its broad, dark leaves moving slow and steady. We stayed like that until the tea was cold and the city had dimmed to its late-night register. 4 days later, the foundation beneath everything shifted. It started with a Wednesday afternoon. I had gone to her clinic for the first time. She needed a ride because her car was in the shop, a 15-year-old Honda that required more maintenance than most of her patients. I waited in the lobby while she finished with a late patient. The clinic was smaller than I expected, clean but modest. The walls held certificates and photographs of babies, each small face representing a journey that started in one of those exam rooms down the hall. A woman in the waiting area looked up from her phone when I sat down. Mid-30s blonde, she looked at me, then she looked again longer. Recognition arrived on her face in stages. She knew me. She had known Claire. She was a friend from Claire's book club. I had picked Claire up from those meetings a dozen times. This woman had been at the funeral. She looked at me sitting in the waiting room of a fertility clinic. Then the door opened, and Lena walked out in her white coat carrying a patient file. The woman's gaze moved from me to Lena and back, and I watched her perform the calculation. A man she associated with a dead wife sitting in a fertility clinic. The dots were available to be connected. In the truck afterward, I told Lena. I told her there was someone in that waiting room who knew my history, who had seen me there, and that if this person put the pieces together, it could reach a place where it mattered. Her reputation, her practice, the professional standing she had built in a field where ethics boards reviewed cases. She went rigid, instantly. Her entire body language changed from the woman who had leaned her head on my shoulder 4 nights ago to the doctor who could not afford a single crack in the wall between her work and her life. She told me I should not come to the clinic again. Her voice was measured, reasonable, presenting the request as logical risk management rather than what it actually was. She was drawing a line, putting me back on the other side of it. I understood the reasoning, but understanding something and accepting it are different operations, and what I felt was a draft from a door closing part way. We drove back in a silence that had edges. She went to her door, and I went to mine. 3 days later, the corporate wellness company that had partnered with Lena's clinic sent a representative to finalize paperwork. The representative, making small talk in Lena's office, mentioned that the introduction had come through Ethan Mercer at Mercer Land Restoration. She said it casually, the way you cite a referral source when the business relationship is already sealed. Lena called me that evening. Her voice was not flat. It was not clinical. It was the voice of a woman who has discovered that the ground she thought was solid had been engineered without her consent. She came to my apartment. She did not sit. She stood in the kitchen, shoulders squared, hands at her sides, occupying the room the way a person occupies a courtroom when they intend to deliver a verdict. You arranged that contract. It was not a question. I told her I had made an introduction. That was all. That is not all. Her voice did not rise. It compressed. You saw my financial situation without me showing it to you. You read my mail on my counter, and then you went behind my back and you solved a problem I did not ask you to solve. You decided what I needed and you provided it, and you let me believe it was luck. I started to respond and she cut through me. Do you know what that looks like from where I am standing? It looks like every man who has ever decided he knew what was best for me. It looks like someone who sees a woman struggling and cannot resist the urge to step in and fix it because fixing things is what makes him feel necessary. You did not ask me. You did not tell me. You arranged my professional life the way you arrange soil. Except I am not soil, Ethan. I'm a person who has spent her entire adult life making sure no one else holds the strings. The kitchen was very quiet when she finished. I could hear the refrigerator and the traffic outside, and the particular sound of two people standing 4 feet apart with the full weight of the truth between them. She was right. Not completely, but enough. I had seen a problem, and I had solved it the way I solve every problem, with my hands from the ground up, without waiting for permission. And the intention had been good, and the execution had been efficient, and the result had saved her clinic, and none of that mattered because I had done it in the dark. I told her she was right. I told her I should have told her. I told her I was afraid that if she knew, she would refuse and the clinic would go under, and I would have stood by and watched it happen when I had the means to prevent it. So you decided for me. Her voice was quieter now, which was worse. To protect me. Just like Clause 14 was written to protect you. We are both very good at deciding what other people need to be shielded from. That sentence landed somewhere in my chest and stayed there. She left. She did not slam the door. She closed it the way she always closed doors. And I stood in my kitchen and I understood for the first time that care and control can wear the same clothes and only the person on the receiving end knows which one showed up. Then the phone call came, a Wednesday morning. I was at the Dorchester site reviewing drainage plans with Ray when my phone rang and I saw her name, and I knew before I answered. There is a space that exists in the half second between picking up a phone and hearing a voice. It is not silence. It is the sound of the world rearranging itself around whatever is about to be said. Her voice was flat, clinical. The voice she used when she was operating as a doctor and not a person. The test is negative. Beta HCG under 5. No pregnancy. She explained what had happened. She had experienced light bleeding on day 10. In her clinical experience, bleeding at that stage combined with her age and history indicated early loss. She had drawn her own blood and run the panel, and the number confirmed what the bleeding had suggested. She told me that if physicians who diagnose themselves are notoriously unreliable because the emotional stakes corrupt the clinical judgment, and that she knew this in theory, she taught it to her residents, and she had been unable to escape it when it happened to her. She had wanted certainty more than she wanted hope, because certainty, even the worst kind, was something she knew how to carry. Hope was the one weight she could not bear to pick up and then drop. The contract has been fulfilled. Those 4 words landed in my chest before my brain had time to process them. I sat down on the edge of the site trailer without meaning to. A bag of topsoil mix tipped over next to me and spilled across the floor, and I did not move to clean it up. I told her the number did not matter to me. I told her we could try again. I told her one failed attempt was not the end of anything. She went quiet, not the soft kind of quiet, the kind that has walls built into it. This was not just an experiment to me, I told her. I know. Her voice was barely audible. That is the problem. She told me she had spent the last several weeks doing something she had not done in years. She had let herself want something that was not measurable, not a hormone level or a cell count or a percentage probability. She had wanted the mornings at the kitchen counter and the plants on the balcony and the particular sound of someone else's breathing in the apartment. She had wanted me specifically, and now the test was negative, and I was still living across the hall being exactly the kind of person she was not supposed to require. She could not hold the grief and the hope and the wanting all at the same time. Something had to be released, and the thing she knew how to release was people. Her mother had taught her that by example, and her father had confirmed it by philosophy, and 32 years of practice had made her fluent in the language of letting go. And she was still angry about the clinic, about the contract I had arranged. The anger and the longing had mixed together into something she could not separate, and she could not look at me without feeling both at the same time, and the combination was unbearable. Let me fall apart alone. That is the only thing I am asking from you right now. Her voice fractured on the word, asking, a hairline crack that ran through the composure like the one in Claire's ceramic pot, small enough to overlook if you were not the kind of person who noticed cracks. I told her I was coming over. Ethan, do not. I crossed the hall. I knocked 3 times. I said her name through the door loudly enough that whoever lived in the units on either side could hear me. I stood there with my hand flat on the wood, and I waited. Nothing. No footsteps. No breathing. Just the particular silence of someone standing very still and hoping that if they do not move, the person on the other side will eventually give up. I stood there for a long time. Then I went back to my apartment and I sat at my kitchen table and I looked at the cutting from the spider plant I had given her. She had accepted it and actually kept it alive, the first thing in her apartment that had survived her care. I sat there and I felt something I did not have a clean word for. It was not just sadness. It was the specific ache of watching something almost take root and then not. The almost that is worse than never because it contains the memory of possibility. I gave her that night. I told myself I would try again in the morning. But in the morning, her doormat was gone. The small woven thing with a leaf pattern that had always looked slightly out of place against the clean lines of her door, but had somehow seemed more like her than anything else in that hallway. Gone. I knocked. A woman I had never seen before opened the door. Young, tired, holding a box. She told me she was a subletter. She told me doctor. Ashford had relocated early. She said Priya Hartley had arranged the sublet and handled the logistics of closing the Boston apartment because Lena had called Priya at 2 in the morning and Priya had driven down from Portland by dawn and packed the essential boxes and handled the lease transfer the way only a friend with 15 years of practice at cleaning up Lena's emotional wreckage could do. The subletter did not have a forwarding address. I stood in that hallway long enough that she started looking uncomfortable. Then I went back inside. On my windowsill where the spider plant cutting sat in its small glass, something had been added. A stem cutting from the fiddle leaf, its broad leaf still green and firm, placed in a cup of water with a folded piece of paper tucked beneath it. I unfolded the paper, her handwriting small and precise. Clause 14, original version. I am sorry. She was invoking the very provision I had struck through. The one she had signed next to my amendment. She was telling me she was going to use the clause I had deleted, and she was apologizing for it in the same breath. And the apology was real, but the invocation was also real, and the reality was that she was gone. I put the cutting in fresh water. I set it in the window where the light was best. I went to work. I threw myself into the ground. There is a particular kind of physical exhaustion you can reach if you dig hard enough and long enough that silences the thinking brain. The muscles take over. The body becomes the primary system and the mind drops to background processing. And for a while, you are just a man with a shovel and the earth and the ancient, uncomplicated transaction between the two. I chased that exhaustion every day. I took a restoration project on the far side of the city, a full acre of compacted urban soil that had been paved over for decades and then abandoned. The asphalt had been removed, but the ground beneath it was dead, compressed, airless. I went there in the cold mornings and I dug. I turned the earth. I broke up the compaction layer by layer with a broad fork and my own body weight, and I planted cover crops that would not bloom until spring. Crimson clover, winter rye, things that work underground, fixing nitrogen, loosening soil structure, preparing the ground for what comes next without any visible evidence on the surface that anything is happening at all. Ray found me there one afternoon, standing in the middle of the torn-up acre, covered in mud, breathing hard. He watched me for a while from the edge of the site. Then he walked over and asked how long I planned to dig, like I was trying to reach the other side of the planet. I told him as long as it took. He was quiet for a moment. Then he told me I had helped her in secret because I was afraid that if she knew the truth, she would leave. And she left. You see the pattern, right? You spent 5 years hiding from grief by working, and you were hiding from her by helping. And in both cases, you thought you were protecting yourself, and in both cases, you were just building a wall between you and the thing you actually wanted. I looked at him. I knew he was right. I knew it the way I knew the compaction layer under my feet was 3 inches thick and required another 2 weeks of work. That night, I did something I had not done in 5 years. I took Claire's plant down from the top shelf. I held it in both hands, the ceramic pot with its hairline cracked, the small, tough leaves that had survived half a decade. I carried it across the kitchen and set it on the windowsill next to the fiddle leaf cutting that Lena had left behind. 2 plants, 2 women, 2 chapters of a life I had not expected to have. I was done keeping the things that mattered in places where I did not have to see them. I called my father. I told him more than I had the first time. Frank listened. When I finished, his voice carried the timbre of a man who has watched too many seasons to be surprised by any single one of them. You know why I plant tomatoes every year I lose most of them? Bugs, blight, sun that comes too hard. But I plant again, not because I am foolish, because the garden is where I want to stand. 7 months of digging, 7 months of projects and contracts and cold mornings and soil that slowly incrementally came back to life under my hands while I waited for something inside me to do the same. And then a contract dispute landed in my inbox that I could not solve from a distance. The Birch Restoration Project outside Portland, a large-scale soil rehabilitation I had bid on 6 months earlier. The site developer was withholding the second payment, claiming my soil prep did not meet specifications. He was wrong. I had the documentation. I had the photographs taken every 2 weeks. I had the soil composition readings, the pH levels, the organic matter percentages, every data point recorded and filed because Frank Mercer's son does not leave evidence to memory. But the developer kept rescheduling meetings. And at some point in the middle of a cold afternoon at the Dorchester site, standing in ground that was finally soft enough to accept seeds, I understood that some people only take you seriously when you are standing in front of them. I drove to Portland, 4 hours. I told myself the entire way that I was going for the contract dispute. I told myself that in very firm, very reasonable terms. I believed myself for approximately the first 2 hours. Then I crossed the state line and stopped believing myself entirely, because I knew the name of her clinic. She had mentioned it once on the balcony, the way you mention the name of a place that exists in your future. Ashford Fertility and Reproductive Care. I had not looked it up. I had not allowed myself, but I knew it. I was going to Portland for the contract. I was going to Portland. The developer's office was on the third floor of a glass building on the west side of Portland that looked like it had been designed to intimidate people who worked with their hands. Polished concrete floors, reception desk made of reclaimed wood that had been sanded and sealed until every trace of its original life had been removed. The receptionist looked at my boots, which still carried clay from a site I had walked through that morning, and I watched her decide whether to ask me to wipe them. The developer's name was Whitfield. Tailored suit aggressive, watched the handshake of a man who had been taught that pressure equaled authority. He began talking about specifications and tolerance, stacking terms on top of each other, like bricks building a wall of language designed to make the person across the desk feel outmatched. I let him finish, then I opened my bag. I laid the photographs across his desk in chronological order. 42 images spanning 6 months of work, each one dated and labeled. I placed the lab reports next to the photographs. pH readings, nitrogen levels, organic matter percentages, moisture content, compaction resistance data, taken with a penetrometer at 12-inch intervals across the entire site. I did not raise my voice. I did not threaten legal action. I simply laid the evidence out in the order it had been collected, the way you lay out seed rows straight and even and spaced correctly, and I let the documentation speak. Whitfield looked at the photographs for 4 minutes. He looked at the soil reports for 6. He picked up one of the lab analyses and held it at an angle as if tilting it might change the numbers. It did not. Soil does not rearrange itself to accommodate the preferences of the person reading the results. He signed the release for the second payment. 40 minutes from the moment I sat down, I shook his hand and collected the documents and walked out with clay still on my boots. I sat in my truck in the parking lot. The engine was off. The October air in Portland carried something that Boston air did not, a closeness to the coast that you could taste salt and pine, and the faint mineral edge of cold water moving over rock. It was 9:30 in the morning. The drive back to Boston was 4 hours. There was no professional reason for me to remain in the city for another minute. I sat there for a long time. Then I started the truck and drove east instead of south, away from Boston, toward the address I had never looked up but somehow knew existed on a quiet street lined with birch trees. The street was exactly what I would have expected if I had allowed myself to expect anything. Two rows of white birches, their bark peeling in thin paper strips, their leaves just beginning to turn from green to gold. The change is not dramatic in birches. It is gradual and honest, and it happens without fanfare, which is perhaps why I have always preferred birches to every other tree. They do their most important work without demanding that anyone watch. The clinic was in a small converted house set back from the street behind a garden bed planted with late-season asters, purple and white still holding their color despite the cooling nights. I noticed the garden before I noticed the building. That is the way my brain operates. It reads the ground first. And this garden told me someone here cared about the details. The building was modest, clean white paint, a simple sign by the front path. It looked like a place where a woman who believed reproductive medicine should not be gated by wealth would open a practice. I walked in. The reception area was small and warm. Behind the front desk, a young woman with dark hair looked up with a professional smile that faltered when I gave her my name. She picked up the phone and said something I could not hear. Then she told me to wait. A nurse came through the side door 30 seconds later, mid-40s, scrubs, an expression that traveled through several stops before settling on neutral. She looked like she wanted to say something. She did not. She simply turned and pointed toward a door at the far end of the corridor that was half open, letting a column of pale afternoon light fall across the floor. I walked down the hall. My boots were quiet on the carpet. I could hear nothing from inside the room. Just the quality of silence that exists in spaces where someone is sitting very still and giving their full attention to something that does not require any action at all. I pushed the door open. She was not at her desk. She was sitting in a chair beside the window, positioned so the afternoon light fell across her lap and across the floor, and across a bassinet that sat next to her in the space where the light was strongest and cleanest. She was not reading. She was not on her phone. She was sitting the way people sit when they are so full of something that there is no room left for doing. When every available space inside them is occupied and the only option remaining is stillness. She heard me. She turned. Her face went through 6 things in 2 seconds. Shock, first raw and uncontrolled, then something that looked like relief and pain arriving simultaneously. Then a rapid, unsuccessful attempt to reinstall the composure that had protected her for years and was now failing because the person standing in the doorway was the one person it had never been designed to defend against. Then surrender, not defeat. The conscious decision to stop trying to control what was already beyond control. My name came out of her mouth like she was surprised to hear herself say it, like the word had been sitting in her throat for months forbidden and had escaped through a door she forgot to lock. I looked at the bassinet. My brain did the math. 7 months since I had last seen her. She had left 2 days after the negative result. The numbers led to a place I had not allowed myself to imagine. I looked at her. She looked at me. The bassinet was between us and the afternoon light was falling across it, and the room was very quiet. She began speaking in a voice I had not heard before. Not clinical, not measured. This voice was lower, slower. It moved through the words the way water moves through soil that has been compacted for years and is only now beginning to open. The test had been drawn too early. She had been anxious and frightened, and she had tested before the embryo had fully implanted at a stage when the hormone levels were too low to register. The bleeding she experienced was not a miscarriage. It was implantation bleeding, a normal event that occurs when the embryo attaches to the uterine wall, and it is one of the most commonly misinterpreted signs in early pregnancy. She, a board-certified reproductive endocrinologist who had explained this exact phenomenon to hundreds of women, had made the same error with her own body that she had spent her career helping others avoid. She grieved. She packed. She left. She crossed the country because staying across the hall felt like standing too close to a fire she had already been burned by, and the only treatment she trusted was distance. 3 weeks after arriving in Portland, the nausea began. Low grade at first, something she attributed to stress and relocation. She ignored it. She pushed through. She told herself that the human body processes grief in unpredictable ways and that nausea was simply the physical vocabulary her system had chosen. Priya Hartley pulled her aside on a Tuesday afternoon in the break room and told her directly without softening that she looked pregnant and that if she did not test herself immediately, then Priya would do it for her and would not be gentle about it. Lena ran the panel herself, alone, in the lab of her own clinic at 7 in the evening after the staff had left. The number came up on the screen, and she did not move for a very long time. She told me this part slowly, each sentence arriving with the weight of a woman who was still recalibrating her understanding of what had happened and what she had almost lost by not knowing it was happening. She had come within 3 weeks of never learning she was pregnant. I asked her why she did not call me. I asked it quietly but directly because the question had been living in my chest for 7 months. She looked down at her hands. They were resting in her lap, folded deliberately motionless. The pregnancy was high risk from the beginning. Her age, her history. At 28 weeks, she developed preeclampsia, a blood pressure complication that put both her and the baby in danger. She spent a week in the hospital. She did not call me during that week. She did not call me when the blood pressure stabilized. She did not call me when the baby kicked for the first time at a strength that startled her. When the ultrasound showed a face with a jawline, she recognized when the due date approached and arrived and then passed. And she lay in a delivery room in Portland with Priya holding one hand and the other hand empty and gripping the rail because the person whose hand belonged there was in Boston and she had made certain he would not know to come. Her answer came in layers. She did not want to call with news that might not survive. She knew my history. She knew about Claire. The idea of calling to say I am pregnant and then calling again to say I lost it was a cruelty she could not risk inflicting. She would rather I lived in ignorance than in the specific agony of hope followed by destruction. Every week that passed without calling made the next week's silence harder to break. The gap widened until it felt uncrossable. The note she had left under the fiddle leaf cutting, close 14. She had invoked the provision I had struck through, using it as armor against the obligation to be honest. And she was still angry about the clinic contract. The anger and the longing had calcified into something she could not separate, and leaving both sealed shut was easier than opening the container and sorting through what was inside. I stood in that room and I absorbed all 4 layers, and I felt them settle into me the way sediment settles after a disturbance, slowly, unevenly. And then I did something I had not done in the entire course of knowing this woman. Not loud, not dramatic, not the kind of anger that fills a room with noise. My anger was the other kind, the quiet kind, the kind that comes from a deep place and speaks clearly and does not raise its voice because it does not need to. I struck through that clause with my own hand. I wrote in the margin that I wanted to know. And you signed next to it. You agreed, and then you folded that agreement and threw it away and left. She did not defend herself. She did not counter with logic or protocol. I know. 2 words. No decoration. I was not finished. Protecting someone by hiding the truth from them is not protection. It is control. It is deciding for them what they can handle and what they cannot. It is the same thing I did with the clinic contract. The same thing exactly. I arranged her professional life without asking. She arranged my personal life without telling. Both of us standing behind our good intentions like they were walls we built so we would not have to be honest about being afraid. She had expected me to be angry about her silence. She had not expected me to include myself in the accusation. She had not expected me to name my own failure alongside hers and hold them up as the same species of cowardice, wearing different clothes. I did the same thing to you. My voice was quieter now. I helped you in secret because I was afraid that if you knew you would leave, and you left, and then you hid from me because you were afraid that if I knew I would come back out of obligation instead of choice. And here I am, not because of a contract, not because of a clause, because I drove 4 hours for a dispute that took 40 minutes. And then I drove across the city to a clinic I have never been to because I could not spend another day pretending I did not know where you were. The room was very still. The light through the window had shifted the afternoon deepening toward the golden hour. The bassinet sat between us, and from inside it came the small sounds of sleep. I walked across the room. Each step covered a distance that could be measured in feet and also in months. I reached the bassinet. He was small, sleeping with one fist curled beside his cheek in dark hair that stuck up at the crown in a direction that suggested it had already formed opinions about which way it intended to grow. His jaw had a line to it that I recognized because I saw it every morning in the mirror and had seen it every Sunday afternoon in my father's workshop for 30 years. I reached into the bassinet and I touched his hand. He did not wake, but his fingers closed around mine with a strength that startled me. Not a grip of desperation or need, a grip of certainty. The grip of something very small that has decided without consultation that the thing it is holding is the thing it intends to keep. I stood there for a long time, not moving, not speaking, feeling the weight of his hand around my finger and understanding that the weight was not just physical. It was the weight of a door opening in a part of my life I had sealed shut 5 years ago. A hand the size of a plum had just reached through the plaster and pulled the boards loose, and the light was coming in, and I did not have the tools or the desire to close it again. Behind me, Lena's voice carried the tremor of a woman saying something she has rehearsed in her head 1,000 times and never spoken aloud. He is yours. He has your hands and your stubbornness. Her voice occupied the narrow territory between a smile and a cry where the most important human emotions live. I looked around the room. My eyes moved from the bassinet to the desk to the window and stopped at the corner nearest the glass where the afternoon light fell in its cleanest column, a ZT plant. Large, full, leaves thick and waxy and dark green, each one reflecting the light with the quiet confidence of something that has survived, not because conditions were ideal, but because it refused the alternative. The same species I had placed in the corner of her Boston apartment, the plant she had tested by withholding water, the plant I had moved closer to the window. She saw me looking at it. I learned to give it what it actually needed instead of what I thought it should need. Her voice was steady now. What remained was the voice of a woman who had made a mistake she understood and had spent 9 months understanding it better, and was now standing on the other side of that understanding, not healed, not fixed, but changed. Changed in the way that soil is changed after a hard winter. Not destroyed, reorganized, ready to support something new. I let go of the bassinet with one hand and I reached for her. She came forward and I pulled her against my chest with my free arm, the baby still gripping my other finger. She was crying. Not dramatic crying. The quiet, slow kind that happens when a person has been holding water behind a dam for so long that the dam does not break so much as it simply becomes porous, allowing what has been stored to seep through at a rate the structure can sustain. I held her until her breathing found a rhythm that matched the baby's. Two sets of lungs moving at different speeds, but in the same room in the same light. I called Frank that evening from the parking lot of a hardware store where I had gone to buy a pot for a Norfolk Island pine I had seen in the nursery section. Frank answered on the second ring. I told him. All of it. The drive, the developer, the clinic, the bassinet. The boy with my hands and my stubbornness in a grip that suggested he had been waiting for someone to hold on to. Frank was quiet for a long time. I could hear him breathing. I could hear something in the background that might have been wind moving through the workshop door he always left open, because he said wood needed to breathe just like people did. Then he told me something I did not expect. He told me that Lena's father, the man who grew tomatoes in New Hampshire, had lived in a town 32 miles from the town where Frank had lived his entire life. He did not know this man, had never met him, But New Hampshire is a small state in the way that matters, meaning the people who grow things in the soil tend to know of each other. And Frank had heard once at a farmer's market in Concord about a man named Ashford who grew tomatoes in ground that every neighbor said would not support them and who produced fruit every season that the soil had no business producing. Two men who never met growing the same thing in the same state, teaching their children the same lesson without knowing the other one existed, that the ground does not owe you anything, that you show up and you work and you put your hands in the dirt and you do not stop when it gets hard, because the stopping is what kills the garden, not the weather, not the soil, not the season. The stopping. His voice carried the timbre of a man who has lived long enough to recognize the shape of things that are not accidental. You found your garden, son. Now stay in it. I went back to the clinic the next morning with the Norfolk Island pine and a bag of tools and a plan that existed only in the broadest terms, which is the only kind worth having because the detailed ones break the moment they encounter reality. Lena was at her desk. The baby, whose name was Milo, which she had chosen because it meant merciful, and because it sounded like a name that could belong to a person who would grow up to be kind, was in the bassinet beside her. He was 3 weeks old, awake now, looking at the ceiling with the focused intensity of someone who has recently arrived in the world and is still assembling a preliminary report on his characteristics. I set the Norfolk Island pine in the corner opposite the ZZ plant. Lena looked at it. She looked at me. She did not ask what I was doing because she had learned by now that asking me that question when I was carrying a plant would receive the same answer every time, and the plant would remain where I put it regardless. I fixed the cabinet in her office kitchen. Same problem as Boston, same hinge, same lean. I fixed it in 4 minutes with a screwdriver and a shim I made from a scrap of cedar. When the door closed flush and silent for the first time, Lena, who was passing through the kitchen with a patient file, paused for exactly 2 seconds and looked at the cabinet and then at me and kept walking. Some things do not require commentary. They require only repetition. The same care applied in a new location. The same attention translated to a different address. That is what roots do. They do not require the soil to be the same. They require only the willingness to grow. I found an apartment 3 blocks from the clinic, small, clean, a balcony facing east that caught the morning light. I began making calls to landscaping companies in the Portland area, not to compete, but to introduce myself, to learn the territory, to understand the soil composition and the drainage patterns and the particular challenges of growing things in a coastal city where the salt air and the clay substrate created conditions that were different from Boston, but not incompatible with 30 years of experience. Ray called me from the Dorchester site on my 3rd day in Portland. He told me 2 things. First, that the cover crops I had planted in the compacted acre were showing their first green shoots above the surface, tiny and tentative and almost invisible unless you were looking for them, which Ray was, because Ray always looked for the things I had planted even when I was not there to see them emerge. Second, he told me that Claire's plant was still alive on my windowsill in the Boston apartment. He had gone by to check on it because he knew I would not ask, and he knew I would not stop thinking about it until someone told me it was okay. He said the fiddle leaf cutting that Lena had left was still in its glass of water next to Claire's pot. The cutting had produced roots, long white threads visible through the glass, reaching downward with the patient determination of something that intends to survive regardless of whether anyone is watching. He said the 2 plants looked like they belonged together on that windowsill. Then his voice shifted to the tone he used when he was about to say something he had been thinking about for a while. He told me he was glad, not about the plants, about the fact that I had finally stopped digging toward the center of the earth and had found something worth growing above the surface instead. That evening, I went to Lena's apartment. She had made dinner. Actually made it, not transferred takeout into a personal container. Actual pasta with actual sauce in a kitchen that showed evidence of actual cooking, a sauce stain on the counter, a pot in the sink, the smell of garlic and olive oil lingering like proof that someone who lived here had decided to participate in the daily ceremony of feeding herself. Milo was in a bouncer on the kitchen floor watching me with dark eyes that were too serious for small talk. His grandfather's eyes. The eyes of a quiet man in New Hampshire who grew tomatoes in soil that should not have supported them, and who never once raised his voice, and who died 3 years ago without knowing that his daughter would spend 8 years helping other people have children while her own window narrowed, and whose grandson was now sitting on a kitchen floor in Portland, looking up at a man with clay on his boots and no plan that extended beyond tomorrow morning, in the absolute certainty that tomorrow morning would be enough. We ate. We did not talk about contracts or clauses or legal documents designed to contain things that cannot be contained. We talked about the Norfolk Island pine and whether it would survive in the office. We talked about a drainage problem I had noticed in the clinic's side yard and how I could fix it with a French drain and some gravel in 2 hours on a Saturday. We talked about a patient who had called Lena that afternoon to report a positive result and how Lena had stepped out of the room and afterward and stood in the hallway and felt something she could finally name. Not grief wearing a borrowed coat, just joy. Plain, unadorned, hers. I washed the dishes while Lena fed Milo in the living room. Through the doorway, I could see them in the lamplight, her dark hair falling forward as she looked down at him, his hand gripping the collar of her shirt, with the same certainty with which he had gripped my finger in the bassinet. On the bookshelf behind her, between medical journals and the novel with the cracked spine, the ZZ plant occupied its corner, with the quiet authority of something that has earned its place by outlasting every prediction of its failure. I finished the dishes. I dried my hands. I leaned in the doorway, and I watched them, and I thought about my father in his workshop in New Hampshire sanding a piece of maple sawdust on his flannel shirt. I thought about Thomas Ashford in his backyard, 32 miles from Frank, his hands in the dirt, a tomato plant bearing fruit that the soil had no business producing. Two men who never met passing the same lesson to their children in different kitchens on different evenings in the same small state, that you show up, that you stay. That the ground is always there and what grows in it depends entirely on whether you are willing to get your hands in it and do the work when the work is hard and when the work is boring and when the work offers no guarantee that anything you plant will survive. Lena looked up. She saw me in the doorway. She did not smile. She did something better than smiling. She looked at me with the full, unguarded attention of a woman who has stopped performing and is simply present. The look contained no clause, no provision, no exit strategy, just the raw, uncontracted fact of a woman seeing a man and choosing not to look away. I crossed the room and sat beside Yer. Milo was falling asleep against her chest, his breathing finding the slow rhythm of a body that trusts completely the arms that hold it. I put my hand on the back of her neck, and she leaned into my shoulder, and we sat there while the evening settled around us and the city outside moved through its own rhythms, and the plants in the apartment did their silent, persistent work of being alive. I am not going back to Boston. She lifted her head. She looked at me carefully, evaluating whether the statement was an emotional response or decision. I have a truck, a set of tools. 40 employees who are good enough to run operations without me pretending my presence in the building is what makes the work happen. Ray can manage the sites. He has been doing it functionally for years. Portland has plenty of neglected ground, and you need someone to fix that cabinet in the clinic kitchen because it has the same problem as the one in Boston, and it is going to drive me out of my mind. She started to speak, the beginning of a sentence that sounded like it contained the word cannot. I watched it form and stall because the word did not make it past whatever was happening inside her when she looked at my hand on Milo's back and her head on my shoulder and the ZZ plant in the corner. This time I am not helping from behind a curtain. I am standing here. You see me, I am telling you directly, and if you want me to leave, I will leave. But you have to say it. No clause 14, no exit provision, just words out loud to my face. The room held still. She looked at me. She looked at the bassinet. She looked at the plant. She looked back at me. The clinic could use more plants. The clinic is a start. The ground is always there. What you grow in it is up to you. And sometimes if you are stubborn enough and patient enough and willing to keep showing up when every rational calculation says to walk away, the soil gives you back more than you put in. Not because you earned it, not because you deserved it, but because that is what soil does when you stop trying to control it and start working with what it actually is. We sat there in the lamplight. The October wind moved through the birch trees outside, and their leaves gold now caught the streetlight and released it and caught it again. Milo shifted against Lena's chest and made a sound that was not a word and was not a cry, but existed somewhere in the territory between the two. The territory where all human communication begins before language arrives and complicates everything with its clauses and provisions and carefully constructed exits. No contract in sight, no fine print, just a man and a woman and a ball and a collection of living things that had survived everything they were not supposed to survive, growing in soil that nobody believed would hold them rooted and reaching and quietly persistently alive.